some of you know me in wearing a different hat than I am today. I'm here today representing the 3 C's Commission of the prior bishop, which is still in existence, those of you that are wondering. And it is churches, clinics, and classrooms with an emphasis on smaller medical centers and schools in Sierra Leone, Africa, Liberia, Russia, and some other special recognition areas. I also am representing United Volunteer Missions, United UMVIM, United Methodist Volunteer and Missions. My husband and I, Reverend John Clark, were in Sierra Leone, Africa 3 years ago, and I'm scheduled to take a team back next year. We worked in a small clinic in Bo, Sierra Leone, and Manjima, and I'll get to that later. But the first thing I want to do is just talk about what your giving does in your church that maybe you don't think about. And I'm going to start here and work my way out. And how many of you have heard of UMCOR? There's a special UMCOR offering every year. Do you make flood buckets or bassinets? And I thought you did. So you've heard of UMCOR. What we do through our offerings to the United Methodist Church, the bad word used to be apportionments. And what is the new word, John? Mission askings is the nicer word. And many people don't understand where those funds go. So I'm here to talk a little bit about that today. And I want you to think about stewardship not as fundraising and not as giving money, but as a way that we direct God's grace into action. And you do it every day at this church, and you do it through the United Methodist, I am tongue-tied today, United Methodist Connectional System. They're not easy words either. So, and it is God's grace given by us in which we take the actions of God's grace out to the world. And that's what we do with what you just did with your offering. And that's what we do with our connectional givings to the United Methodist Church. Slide 1, we'll start with that. The best person that ever explained what this is was John Wesley, our founder. He was the first theologian of all of the theologians to actually define what God's grace was. And he explained it comes before us. It's out there. God's reaching out to us, and it's up to us to accept it. We don't take it from him. We don't earn it. It's there. And we can accept it and take it, or we can walk away from it. But that's what God's grace is. And he called it prevenient grace. And so when you hear someone talk about Wesley's prevenient grace, that's all it means. God loves you. It's there. It's up to you to take it. And it's up to you to do something with it. And that's where John Wesley took it a little further. I run into people all the time that say, I'm saved, and that's nice. That's great. But do you stop there? John Wesley said, no, that's the beginning. I always talk to John about it's getting on the bus. When you get saved, you're on the bus. But you can get off of that bus. Or you can stay on that bus and do what we're supposed to do. So Wesley's means of grace is putting grace to work every day through action. And as being stewards of that grace, we're supposed to do something with it. Now, he defined it, and this will sound really familiar to you, he defined it as doing it through your prayers, your presence or your attendance, through compassion and action, through gifts of money and time and talent and witness. Does that sound familiar to you all when you took your oath as United Methodists? That's where that came from. That's from John Wesley. So I want to do a test, and we're going to see how you all here actually are already putting some of that grace into action that you may not even be aware of it. So what I'm going to ask you is, if I describe you, I want you to stand up. If you can't stand up, raise your hand. And we're going to see, I'll bet every one of you will be on your feet or have your hand up by the end of this. And this is just to help you see how you are already doing Christ's work. Who teaches or taught public school or Sunday school or Bible study or small groups? Stand up, please. Who has coached a youth team or an adult team, an adult league? Who has given items or cash donations to your clothing giveaway downstairs, to Goodwill, Salvation Army, a rummage sale? Who donates to a nonprofit agency? Who works on fifth Sunday meals or seventh lunches or other community fundraising dinners? Boy, you're almost already up. This is good. Who's prayed for others or sent a card or a remembrance? Who attended this worship or another church or another community event that's faith-based, just so your presence is there? You can go ahead and start raising your hands now when I repeat. Who has given money to those things? That's your resources. Who's driven a member or a friend or a neighbor or kids somewhere and spent your own money on the gas? Lots of you. Who's visited someone in the hospital, hospice, or nursing homes? Who's cooked meals for the church? Who sings? Who gives their time and talent to the children's concert? Who sings in the cantata? I'm guessing a few of these guys back here and out here as well. Who calls on a shut-in, helps a neighbor that needs help? Who's made crafts, knitted things? What about, you mentioned flood buckets, school supplies? Who's acted as a secretary or taken minutes? These are the least appreciated human beings on the world, so I wanted to see if somebody can raise their hand, because nobody says thank you to these people, and it's not an easy job. Who's taught budget, finance, job training, self-development, or employment skills? Tutored, taught a skill, you know. Okay, guys, who's helped fix a car, changed a tire, or made a repair for somebody else? And ladies, who's cleaned the church, gardened, cleaned up after a tragedy? Has anyone here gone on a mission trip? Okay. How about an educational trip to expand your own knowledge so that you can share it? Okay. How about, does anyone do any prison ministry, street ministry, supported delinquents? Anyone in the congregation? And this is one I think you can all get, and you all are already up, but who smiled at someone you don't know? Isn't that the easiest thing we can do? And all the things I gave, it doesn't cost anything, take any of your time or any of your resources. You just got to lift the lips. Well, that's probably the coolest thing we do. Thank you. You can sit down. Now, let's look at something you may not realize you're doing or you're not conscious of, and that you support in your church's apportionments. Yeah, can you back up one? There it is. Okay, this is Firelands District, your district. These are all missions here in this area that your mission giving supports. And I bet a lot of you have no idea you're supporting all these things right here in your own district. That's where some of that money you give in your annual giving goes to, is into this Firelands District mission programs. Another thing that I don't know how many of you knew, but you actually were given a donation to your meal program downstairs just this past year. So, and that came from that money. So it came right back to you, which is kind of cool. Now I can go to the next one. I mentioned UMCOR, flood buckets. My daughter, John and my daughter, lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and you recall about 3 years ago they had a horrible flood. Tennessee River came up over its banks and wiped out the main entertainment area. And it was just filthy, horrible, dirty water. My daughter at that time was working downtown, and she said everybody came out of the buildings and was going, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And the very first truck to drive up to that flood had UMCOR on the side. She said, you didn't see it in the papers, you didn't see it on TV. They focused on all the Red Cross and everyone else later, who came later. She said the first truck to drive up was that UMCOR truck, and lifted the back and started handing out the flood buckets and told people how to use them. She said, I've never been so proud to be a United Methodist. So why do we Methodists and other faiths do all these things that involve compassion and kindness? And aside from it's being Christ-like, we certainly have had Christ as our model, our childhood. But aside from that, you might be interested to know it's also scientific. There's some scientific reasons. Dr. Emma Sapala actually verified that showing compassion and kindness is an innate instinct, and it's one of the first instincts we develop as children. And she did a study where she took 2-year-olds, and she went to a preschool, and she had made a recording of a baby crying, desperately crying, just that sobbing, gasping that babies do. And she had built a wall out of those padded triangles and tubes and crates and things that you find in a child care center. And she'd made a wall so that when the preschoolers came in, the 2-year-olds came in, they couldn't see behind that wall. And she'd made a recording of this baby sobbing and gasping and started playing it. The children are doing their things and they're playing in their room. Every child in that room desperately tried to get through that wall. They crawled over it, they pulled things apart, and she said, why do we think we're evil right away? It's natural for us to be kind. What happens is we get diverted. The outside world and things we're taught and modeled that aren't good take over. But every single 2-year-old baby tried to get through that wall. So she said it's natural for us to be this way. So what do we need? We need to be reminded, and we need to be taught as a second step so that we don't lose that. And where do we get that, guys? You all know it, through Christ's actions, reading about it, being taught about it, and seeing other people show kindness. The other thing she found is that people, it's good for us to be kind and generous, that we actually feel good. And I bet right now, if you think about a teacher or a friend or someone who's been kind to you in your past, how good it made you to see them doing that, to actually see people being kind. When I watch the news and I see one of the stories that finally is about something good, you just feel uplifted. You find yourself smiling. We want to see kindness and gentleness. And so it's natural, but it's also taught. And so we have to remember that when we do things that are unselfish, it is benefiting others, but it's also benefiting us. And I think, as John would say, I think Christ is grateful and pleased. So right now, I'm going to take you away from here and share with you some slides from our trip and a little bit of the experiences we had, just to give you a sense of what it was like for us to be the stranger. The scripture read, when was I a stranger? When was I hungry? Well, when we are traveling overseas into a foreign country, we are the strangers. We are meeting strangers, but we are actually the strangers ourselves. And the people of Sierra Leone are some of the friendliest, most gracious people I've ever met in my entire life. And we are having an opportunity to go there. If you look at the top of your bulletin, I don't have it under me right now, but if you look right at the top of your bulletin, our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And what's the rest of it say? For the transformation of the world. Not just me, not just the person right here, but the world. And so if we don't go out into countries like Sierra Leone, which are 70% Muslim, how are they going to know who Christ is? How are they going to know what it is to be Christ-like? They aren't going to know. And so we go. We go as missionaries. Well, we rode for 36 hours of flying and delayed airplanes and then a 5-hour bus ride. And this is our team. It was mostly from the Tuscarawas district. We had a couple of nurses, we had an OBGYN, we had a number of pastors, we had a professor from Mount Union. Because we worked with ministers while we were there, we worked with school children, and we worked in a medical clinic. So we were doing all three of the 3 C's. And after that, when I opened my eyes, I'm on a bus for 5 hours in the dark, the very first thing I saw was that. And I went, oh my gosh, John, we really are in Africa. And it is an amazing place. And then the very next thing we saw was the abject poverty of the country. If you look at the buildings on the right, that is a nice home. This country is really poor. The village you saw, the first slide, is probably a better built village, but many, many of the huts are just whatever they can find. And this was a stand along the road, and the young lady was selling bananas to us. And we found them to be so friendly and disarming. Our very first interaction was with this young lady who was just delightful. The next slide I'm going to show you is a typical road. Now this is a good road in Sierra Leone. And if you look on the very far right, you'll see 2 little girls in blue uniforms. My whole time there, I kept seeing these blue uniforms, and I knew the government required children to go to school, and I assumed these were government-funded schools, and that was their uniform. And about probably 2.5 weeks, I mentioned it to our driver and said, I see blue uniforms everywhere. I said, that's great, your government's doing that. And he went, oh, no, Miss Connie. Those are United Methodist uniforms. Those children all go to United Methodist schools. There are 400 of them in Sierra Leone. In the tiniest villages, in the most remote corners, it's the United Methodists that are educating the children. So what do we think they're learning? We know what they're learning. It's wonderful. The next picture is in Bo, where we were based, and these are some school children in those blue uniforms. And the Child Rescue Center is the building that is in the next picture. It was started by the United Methodist Church during a horrible revolution and civil war that they had about 11 or 12 years ago. And there were just massive orphans on the streets. And the United Methodist Church built the rescue center, brought in a team, and literally plucked orphans off of the street. And they gave them a home and food and began to educate them. I should have included a picture for you. There was a reunion just about a month ago of graduates from that rescue center. 2 of them are teachers. 1 of them is a doctor. 1 of them is a nurse. 1 of them is a community service worker. 1 of them is a health worker. And 1 is our dear friend Gandabasi, who used to think he wanted to be a bishop in the United Methodist Church, but he said now he realizes he just wants to help children like himself, and he has started a nonprofit funded and helped by United Methodist Church to continue to pull orphans and starving children out of their situations there. And so it was quite an amazing thing. The Mercy Hospital is the next slide, and that is United Methodist Hospital. The hospitals in Sierra Leone that are the best are the ones run by our church. It's amazing. When we went into the ones not run by ours to help, it was pretty frightening. And then we went into ours, and they would remind you very much of inside of what we have back in maybe the 1950s, if you think of churches hospitals back then. The next picture is the clinic where John and I worked every day, and our team went, and we worked with villagers, some of whom walked 16 miles one way to get care there. It's a women's health clinic, and we serve everyone besides women, but it is geared toward helping women having difficulty with birth. And we trained a lot of what they call tribal birth assistants, which we would call midwives. There are about 32, and I'll have a picture of those for you later. The next picture is a classic Sierra Leone woman carrying her baby. They just grab a piece of fabric and wrap it around themselves and head off into the jungle. It's really cool. And they're beautiful people. And the next one is fun. And I should let John tell you this, and he will be up here talking to you in a minute. But while we were there, I got to be friends with the women in the clinic, and they came out very excited one day and said, Miss Connie, there's a baby being born. There's a baby being born. You have to come. And I came in, and it was a little boy. And they said, we know your name is Connie, but it's a boy. Who's your husband? They didn't say, what's your husband's name? Who's your husband? And I said, well, my husband is Reverend John out there. And they said, well, his name's going to be Reverend John. And I went, no, his name is John. No, his name is going to be Reverend John. And I said, do you know what you're doing to this child? But his name is Reverend John, and we get pictures all the time of little Reverend John, who's now 3 years old. And this is John sitting with little Reverend John. And that actually is a nursemaid mother, so that the mother could take a break. One of the village women takes the place in case the baby wakes up and needs comforting. It's pretty cool. And then inside the Manjima United Methodist Church is the next picture. This is a church, guys. We know this sanctuary needs some repairs. But I think if you look at this church in Sierra Leone, it has no windows, it has a tin ceiling, but to them this is a luxury facility because it's block. And it was built by the Methodist Church, and you see the school children in their uniforms inside it. We were very privileged to even go to this village. We were invited there by a Muslim chief, and the only way you can get there is to walk. And he invited us to come. And he wanted to explain to us that they love us teaching about Jesus Christ, that they live in perfect harmony with Christians, and that they are even greater fear than we are of the radicals because they feel they are in danger, because they are so friendly with Christians. They have their country, when it had Ebola a year and a half ago, the government wasn't trusted. Would it go out to the villages? They wouldn't listen to the government people trying to tell them they had to give up some of their tribal ways to keep from spreading the disease. They came to the United Methodist Church and said, your people are trusted. And so it was United Methodists that took out the word and how to fight Ebola, because they are so loved and so trusted in that country. So we have a wonderful partnership there. And imagine how many of these kids in that village have now become United Methodists because of our presence. It was really cool. But he really wanted us to understand that they welcome Christians, and that he said most of their families are mixed. They'll have a Muslim husband and a Christian wife, or the reverse, and the children all become United Methodists because the school is United Methodist and the church is United Methodist, and that's okay with him. He didn't care. So I wanted to share that. It's an interesting story. Water is very precious, and the next picture is a stick-built fence built by the villagers to protect a well that we put in, because safe drinking water is critical there and very scarce. And the next picture is the village of Philoan, where we did a health clinic training with the tribal birth mothers. Does not that look like classic Africa? And I was going crazy with my camera because I'm an amateur photographer. And the next picture is the women actually who work with the villages. And these are the ladies that are the midwives, basically. They're all United Methodists. And they pray with their village women when they go to help. And then the very next picture is the United Methodist school children. just surrounding one of our friends, and you can see the tin roof on the school in the corner there. I do want to teach you a story about that village. This was all in that particular village. When we were leaving, the Reverend, the United Methodist pastor, Reverend Omaro, came up, and he said that the chief and the villagers wanted to give us a gift. And we have seen these people with nothing. And I'm like, okay. And he came walking out with a big bag of sweet potatoes. The most precious thing these people have is food. It's the most scarce thing that they have. And so they were giving us enough sweet potatoes to feed that whole village. And I'm like, well, why don't you keep that for the... No. This is our gift to you. And it taught me that selfless giving that is in people. And we did take it, and it made me think about when was I a stranger? When was I hungry? So we learned a lot of things there about what our church is doing that no one had ever told me about before. I had no idea we had these schools all over Sierra Leone. I didn't know it. And I wanted you to see that that is our way of showing compassion, and that is the way of making disciples of Christ, is when we go out in mission work, think of the people we are touching and running into. And we have dear friends that email us all the time. It's one of the few things they have when they go to the big city, and we've kept contact with them. So I mentioned giving to others makes us feel better, and the reality is that when we are truly Christ-like, it's easy to do, and we are thankful givers. And when we lift others and show compassion, we're helping ourselves, and we're helping spread the mission of the United Methodist Church all over the world. And isn't that what Christ taught us to do? He said, go feed the sheep. It wasn't if you want them. It was go feed them. You go do it. And it's not the easiest thing to go into a country like Sierra Leone, I'll tell you. That took some praying. So, members of Norwalk United Methodist Church, every day, you guys are witnessing where your treasure is and where your heart is, every single day. And I wanted to remind you of some things that you do here to bring it back to you and what you do in this church. There's a list up of the groups you serve and the ministries you do. And you are sharing your faith journey among other United Methodists all the time through your giving. And you are showing your faith journey here and sharing that living Christ grace that Wesley told us to do. That we are actually out there sharing God's grace with the world. And I'm now going to ask my husband to share a few words. John was raised in the Philippines as a missionary son. We lived there for 17 years. So he has a few things to share with you, and then at the end of the service, he will do your benediction. Thank you.
It's anticlimactic. You did such a good job. It was one. Imagine your birth certificate saying Reverend John. Yeah. The Gospel of John records in chapter 6, after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. I wonder if it's like being on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. And Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get even a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they all sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. There were 12, they filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." You're all familiar with the feeding of the 5,000. It's an interesting miracle because it's the only miracle. It must have been a very important event in Jesus' life. It's the only miracle that's in all 4 Gospels. But I'm here to tell you, Connie talked about growing up on the mission field. The miracle of the fishes and loaves is alive and well and still at work today. When my father first got to the Philippines, he was in a very remote place, and the people were starving and suffering from malnutrition. And so Dad asked the Methodist Church to send a missionary, and they sent a missionary which was paid for by apportionment dollars. And he taught the people to grow peanuts and beans and higher quality of rice. And what ended up happening is a small amount given by small churches everywhere ended up feeding 5,000, many more than 5,000, and it ended up feeding the people of the Cagayan Valley. Now, I got to witness that growing up. So for me, the miracle of the fishes and loaves is alive and well. It's still going on. Our trip to Sierra Leone is another example of that. We had small churches in the Tuscaroras district give just a little, but together it became a lot. Together it became a lot. So what is our task? Our task is to come up with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And if we can come up with the 5 loaves and 2 fish or the equivalent in our offering, Jesus will multiply the rest. The multiplication takes place with the disciples doing the work, with Pastor Omaru and the sweet potatoes. It'll take place. But what is key in that Bible passage is the boy who was willing to share his 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so that's our task. Are we willing to share 5 loaves and 2 fish? Because if we do, Jesus will do the rest. Amen? Amen indeed.